sparks of Torah, tidbits on the weekly Torah portion. This week, Vayakhel, Pekudei, two different portions. Year. Sections are combined and not others is an indication that those that are combined have a connection to one another. And when we survey all these double portions, at least most of them, a pattern becomes very clear that they are paradoxes. And take, for example, Vayakhel means "and he gathered," referring to how Moses, after coming down from the mountain for the third time, the second set of tablets, the day after Yom Kippur, as Rashi says, that this is when this gathering occurred, Moses gathers all the people to address them about the construction of the Mishkan, the tabernacle, the portable sanctuary in the desert. So the word Vayakhel refers to taking individuals and consolidating them, integrating them, uniting them into one community. So it's about the idea of community, the collective aspect of Jewish people. The next section is called Pekudei. Literally, Pekudei means the accounting. It's a reference to the accounting that Moses gave concerning the items that were contributed for the construction of the Mishkan. Now, when you make an accounting, you have to count each item individually in order to know their sum. So the focus of the word Pekudei is on the individuals. So we have this paradox. We have the Vayakhel, the collective aspect of the Jewish people, and Pekudei, even though it's referring to the items, but the word itself is representative of the idea of the details of the individuals. And we discussed this point many times, the point that the Rebbe makes. The Rebbe goes much deeper into it, but the idea is that we have to focus simultaneously on the klal, on the group, on the community, and on the individual. We should see the needs of the individual and not just focus on community. And at the same time, when we look at an individual, we should see him or her as a reflection of an entire community. I mentioned that this is the beginning of the double portion season. Everything happens by divine providence, and we're still in the spirit of Purim, so we could say something, a little bit of levity is allowed. This happens to be the time of the year when the baseball season, at least the spring training, begins, so maybe there's some connection there between baseball and Havdil, the Torah portion. But as the Rebbe would always teach us, that we have to learn everything from everything that happens, a lesson in the way we serve God. And the game of baseball, in fact, the Rebbe once gave an explanation of the game of soccer, of European football, how it can be applied to serving God. Well, the game of baseball has one very beautiful concept that makes it patently Jewish. And this is not a recommendation for people to watch baseball games, but baseball is a game in which you score by getting home. And that's a very powerful message. In Judaism, you score when you come home. Coming home has many connotations. One of them is, as much as we may stray from the way that God had set forth for us in the Torah, this is the portion that follows the story of the golden calf, we always come home. We always come back. Moses comes down from the mountain with the second set of tablets, an indication that God had forgiven the Jewish people for their drifting and going away from home. The concept of coming home is further enhanced when we realize that the whole purpose of creation, as we said in many occasions, based on the Midrash and explained at great length in the classic Hasidic work of the Tanya, and especially in the Rebbe's teachings, that the purpose of creation was for God to have a dwelling place, a home in this world, and it's our mission to create that home by making this world a inviting world for God through the observance of the commandments of the Torah and the study of Torah, of course. So the idea of coming home is very much a part of this parsha, in addition to the fact that it's about the Mishkan, God's home, which is the prototype for the entire universe, which ultimately in the days of Mashiach will become God's home, in which he will dwell very comfortably with all of us together as one. This week is also Parshas Parah. There are 4 special Torah readings that we do before Purim and until before Pesach. In the course of about a month, we read 4 different portions. The first one was Shkolim, where we spoke about the need to give the half shekel. That was done before Purim, right before Purim rather. Shkolim is even before that, but right before Purim is Parsha Zachar, remembering Amalek, the evil nation that attacked us. That is a preparation for Purim, in which we remember how a descendant of Amalek, Haman, tried to annihilate and exterminate the Jewish people. And this week is Parshas Parah. We read about the red heifer, the red cow, that was used as a way of purifying a person who had come in contact with the dead, and that person would be precluded from participating in the Paschal offering, or for that matter any other offering that required entering into the temple, unless they went through this purification rite, which involved this red cow, this enigmatic red cow. And there's a very beautiful saying of the Rebbe. We all know that the Torah refers to this purification process as a chok, as a statute, meaning a commandment for which there is no reason. It's an enigmatic commandment. It's paradoxical. And the way it's understood conventionally, why is it paradoxical? Because the person who gets the sprinkling of the ashes diluted with water of the red heifer on him would become purified, whereas the people that were involved in the preparation would become contaminated. So it, to use the expression used by our sages, it purified those who were unclean, but it also contaminated those who are clean. That's the paradox. That's what makes very little logical sense, and that's why it's called a chok, a commandment that's beyond our understanding. So the Rebbe once asked, why is it such a enigmatic thing that people who are involved with purifying should become unclean? That's a very common thing, that when people are involved in helping someone, they too can become part of the problem, especially if it's a disease. So what is the enigma that the people who are involved in the purification become unclean, even as they make the person who receives the treatment purified and clean? When we say clean, we're talking about a ritual cleanliness, not a physical cleanliness. We're not talking about impurity in a physical sense, but a spiritual, ritualistic form of impurity. And the Rebbe answered that the enigma here is that the one who does the actual sprinkling, he does not become contaminated. Everyone else who's involved in the preparation of the ashes of this red cow, they become contaminated. But you'd think that the one who actually does the sprinkling, who's involved in the actual process of sprinkling on the person who was unclean, that he too would become unclean as all the others who did the preliminary preparations. No, he does not become unclean. And the lesson from this is that although rationally, when we help someone, and I'm adding some elaboration, I don't know if the Rebbe used these terms, but when you're trying to drag someone out of the mud, someone who's sinking in the mud, and you're pulling him out of the mud, you become soiled as well. And here we're told that yes, everyone who's involved becomes soiled, but the person who actually helps purify the other, he does not become soiled. That's not logical and rational, but that's the beauty and the gift that God gives us that is beyond understanding, that the person who's involved in helping others doesn't lose any of their innocence, any of their integrity, just because they're going down into the dumps, so to speak, and helping someone, pulling them out of their predicament. It's like a doctor who goes into an area that's quarantined because of some contagious disease, and everyone around contracts the contagious disease because it's so toxic, but the doctor who's going in to treat those people somehow immune and does not become affected. That's the miracle of going out to help someone else, that you will become impervious and immune to the disease that you're trying to help the person recover from. Now that we covered that briefly, let's go a little bit into the subject matter of Vayakhel first. Moses gathers all the people, and he gives them the commandment to observe the Shabbos first, and then to build the Mishkan, the tabernacle. When did this happen? I mentioned before, quoting Rashi, the day after Yom Kippur, because as soon as Moses went up on the mountain, he comes down, shatters the tablets. When he sees the people worshiping the golden calf, goes back up again to get God to forgive the people. God says, okay, go back down, get some sapphire, bring it up. So he's up and down from the mountain in 3 segments of 40 days and 40 nights. So there was no time for him to do anything else but go up there and go down, go up and down. So this occurs after the 3rd time that Moses is up on the mountain. He's coming down. And when does he come down? On Yom Kippur, the 10th day of Tishrei, which later on became the Day of Atonement. And it makes sense. There's a historical basis for that day. It's the day that God demonstrated his full forgiveness of the Jewish people for committing this heinous sin, worshiping of the golden calf. So this is the day after Yom Kippur, the day after Moses gathers the people and tells them about the Mishkan, about the tabernacle. We also know that Moses did talk about other subjects, because earlier, a few weeks ago, we read the portion of Mishpatim, the portion of Yisro rather, where Moshe is judging the people from morning till afternoon, and his father-in-law Yisro rebukes him and says, how could you do it all yourself? You have to delegate responsibility, and God confirms and affirms what Yisro said. When did this happen? When was Moses judging all the people? So again, our sages tell us it happened the day after Yom Kippur. When Moses comes down the 3rd time, he sat down to judge the people. So there were 2 things that he did. Number 1, to tell the people about building the Mishkan, and number 2, he judged the people and dealt with their civil issues, the laws concerning whatever monetary issues that would come up, or other issues that come up between people. He was there to judge them. So one of the commentators points out that the fact that he chose these 2 things was not somehow haphazard. There was a reason for the 2. Here Moses is being told by God to tell the people to create a sanctuary, a place that is holy. Moses knew that he's going to get the people to contribute to this cause. He wanted to make sure that the contributions were clean and pure, that there wasn't even a trace of gezel, of theft, of any type of fraud. And that's why he made sure to judge all the people. Anyone who had a complaint that someone had taken something from him, that somehow he was cheated out of money in some form, in some way, he wanted to make everything good in that area, so that the Mishkan, the sanctuary, should not be contaminated by this type of tainted money. And this is a very important lesson for our own day and age, where people might try to rationalize committing some type of dishonesty because they know they're going to give money to charity, to build a synagogue, a sanctuary, or any other mitzvah. That's referred to as trying to bribe God. And the Torah says clearly, God does not take any bribes. Just like he tells us we can't bribe others, we can't bribe our judges, God himself says in the Torah, he doesn't accept any bribe. What is a bribe for God? Doing a mitzvah, doing something that he wants us to do, building him a sanctuary, building him a home. It cannot be done at the expense of any type of crime. You can't give tzedakah, you can't give charity taken from money that is obtained illegally. When Moses introduces the Mishkan, he first tells them about the laws of the Shabbos, of the Sabbath, very briefly. He starts off by saying, 6 days shall work be done, the seventh day is a day of holiness for you. And it's a day when you're not allowed to do any work. Specifically, he mentions one of the 39 types of labor that are forbidden on Shabbos, and that is lighting a fire. We'll get to that in a moment. That comes right before the commandment to build the Mishkan. Now, Shabbos laws have already been given on the Ten Commandments. They're already mentioned in the earlier last week's Parsha, Kisisa. Why are they mentioned here? Why does he preface the communication about the Mishkan with the laws of Shabbos? And the Rashi quotes the teaching taken from earlier sources, the Talmudic sources, that this is to teach us that the Shabbos does not override, the building of the Mishkan rather, does not override the Shabbos. This is to tell us, Rashi says, that building the Mishkan does not suspend the laws of the Shabbos. What does that mean? That is, holy as it is to build God a sanctuary, the Shabbos is even holier. And the application to that in our own day and age is the mistake that many people have made in the past, thinking that going to shul to pray overrides the laws against driving on Shabbos. There are people who don't know any better, and they have good intentions, and people, if they wouldn't go to shul on Shabbos, you could argue, would never be exposed to Judaism. But everyone has to ultimately realize that the ultimate goal is to keep Shabbos, even at the expense of not having a shul, even at the expense of not praying with a minyan, with a quorum. Shabbos overrides every other mitzvah except for matters of life and death, of course. The commandment that's mentioned over here is not to light a fire. Now, the way it's phrased can give room for the erroneous translation that no fire should be allowed to burn on Shabbos. And in fact, the breakaway group called the Sadducees, who lived in the days of the Second Temple, and then another breakaway group called the Karaites, who started off in about the 10th, 9th, 10th century, who broke away from traditional Judaism, and they took, in their own words, the Torah at face value and rejected all the oral traditions that were passed down generation to generation all the way back to Mount Sinai. Most of the Torah that was given orally. The written Torah is just an outline. And without the oral Torah, the written Torah is really unintelligible, sometimes contradictory, mostly ambiguous, and without the oral tradition, we can't really say we're following the Torah. But these people rejected rabbinic authority who transmitted the oral teachings and took the Torah very literally. And the Karaites, of at least some generations, it could be they changed it because they were constantly disagreeing with themselves, because it's impossible to interpret the Torah without having the official interpretation that was given to us by God at Mount Sinai. And they decided that we're not allowed to have any fires on Shabbos, so you couldn't have any light on Shabbos, because that would mean that you would have to keep your fire burning. You couldn't have any heat on Shabbos, because that would mean you would have to have your fireplace burning. And you couldn't have any warm food on Shabbos, because that would mean you would have to have a fire, food on the stove, on the fire. That is why there's a custom that Jews have to eat what is called cholent. Cholent is a stew that stays on the fire, covered up with a metal sheet called a blech, so we don't see the fire and maybe forget that it's Shabbos and adjust the flame. But we keep that on the fire. We put it on before Shabbos. It's mostly cooked before Shabbos, and it burns all night, and when we come home from shul, usually around noon or thereabouts, we eat this stew. Some people have different recipes. Sephardic Jews have a little different recipe than Ashkenazic Jews. But one of the reasons for eating that is not just because it's a delicacy to many people. It's a matter of taste, of course, but because it's a way of us demonstrating that we do not accept the heresy of the Karaites who rejected the oral tradition, which is really tantamount to rejecting God's will. That he says to us that you cannot light a fire, but you could have fires burning in your house on Shabbos, if everything is done the right way, of course. And therefore, it's a point of eating something hot. If you don't have cholent, if for some reason you don't want to let a fire burning, drinking hot water in a percolator is also a way of fulfilling that requirement of eating something hot on Shabbos. Another tradition that is based partly on this rejection of the heresy that you can't have anything burning on Shabbos is the lighting of the Shabbos candles. Now, the main reasons for lighting the Shabbos candles, there are three main reasons. This is a fourth reason, you could say. The main reason for lighting Shabbos candles before sunset, of course, is number one, to prevent any type of mishap in the house that can cause to domestic quarrels. You don't want it to be dark in the house. In the olden days when they didn't have electricity, you wanted to make sure that it was light in the house, so you'd light candles before Shabbos to keep the peace and the serenity. Number two, it makes the meals more enjoyable by having light or enhanced light. Number three, it shows that you honor the Shabbos. But number four, it's to show that we do not subscribe to the Karaites and the Sadducees who say you cannot have fire burning in your house on Shabbos. Yes, we could have, as long as it was lit before Shabbos. The Torah, when it goes through all the different things that were made in the Mishkan, and talking about the architects, Bezalel and Holiov, after going through all the different items and what they made and how they made it, the next portion, Pekudei, the second portion, picks up with the words, these are the reckonings of the tabernacle, the reckonings, the accounting of the Mishkan, which is called the tabernacle of testimony, which were reckoned at Moses' bidding, counted at Moses' bidding. And it goes on to tell us all of what they did, all the materials and how much they weighed. But the Torah uses the word Mishkan here, tabernacle, twice. So Rashi observes this repetition and says that the word Mishkan, it's a play on words, has another meaning. The simple meaning of Mishkan is a sanctuary, a place where God would dwell. But the word Mishkan is also related to a word mashkon, which means something that you take as a pledge, as collateral for a loan. For example, you borrow $1,000, and in order to guarantee that you will repay it, you give your car as collateral. And if in an event that you don't pay, then you lose your car, whatever the item may be. Well, that's what the sanctuaries were. There were two temples that we had, and they were both taken away from us. And God took them because we owed him something. We didn't fulfill the commandments the way we should have, and God appropriated those two temples. And the Rebbe asked the question, why would you want to allude to the destruction of the temples in the very section where God is talking about the building of the first sanctuary? Why would you want to allude to its destruction? And the Rebbe says, no, on the contrary, this is the proof. This is the place where the Torah makes it very clear that the temples are eternal, notwithstanding the fact that they were physically destroyed. Because when you talk about taking something as a pledge, that means the pledge is there, the collateral is there. It's just taken away from you temporarily until you repay your debts. But eventually it will be returned, and it is not something that is destroyed. It's not, the destruction is not real God is preparing the temple for us even as we speak, getting it ready for us to be with this third temple very soon in the days of Mashiach. At the end of the parsha, we'll skip to the very end. The Torah talks about how the Jewish people would travel. Whenever the cloud hovered over the Mishkan, then they knew that they had to stay put. To quote the words over here, when the cloud was raised up from upon the tabernacle, the children of Israel would embark on their journeys. If the cloud did not rise up, they would not embark until the day it rose up. So what it tells us over here is that we know that the Jews traveled in the desert 42 journeys. How do they know when to pack everything up and start to travel to the next location? As long as the cloud was hovering over the Mishkan, they knew they had to stay put. As soon as the cloud lifted, that was a signal for them to start their journey. Now, if you read the text, and I'll read it again, it's repetitious. Because in one verse it says, this is at the very end of the section, it says, when the cloud was raised up upon the tabernacle, the children of Israel would embark on all their journeys. So what do we know from that? That if the cloud was not raised up, the inference is, then of course they didn't travel. So then why does it have to say in the next verse, if the cloud did not rise up, they would not embark until the day it rose up? That was already said. We already said that when the cloud was raised up, then they would embark, implying that if the cloud didn't raise up, they would stay put. So the Torah doesn't have to repeat it and say the negative when it already said the positive. It already phrased it in the positive, that if the cloud raised up, they would travel, implying that if it didn't raise up, they would not travel. So why the repetition? And then very briefly, the point is that if they wouldn't have repeated it, the people would have not taken the fact that the cloud was resting as a signal that they should stay put and not journey. Because if you remember, when the Jews stood in front of the Red Sea, pursued by the Egyptians, the sea on this side, no place to go, some of the Jews started to cry out to God. Some wanted to go back to Egypt, some wanted to fight, some wanted to commit suicide. And God says to the people, stop crying out to me, tell them to keep on going, journeying. And the Rebbe explains that when God gives us a mission, and he tells us, your mission is to go to Mount Sinai, that's why you were taken out of Egypt, there's no room for anything else, certainly not to commit suicide, certainly not to go back to Egypt as slaves, not even to fight the Egyptians, but not even to pray to God for help, because God already told you what he wants. He wants you to journey for further. Once that happened, that idea that we have a destination, a mission, and we cannot be sidetracked, and nothing could take us and distract us from that goal, that became programmed into the psyche of the Jewish people. They were journeyers. They knew they had to go forward. So therefore the Torah, when it says that if the cloud was raised up, they would journey, they would think that once it was raised up the first time, this was a green light and they were never to stop. Even if the cloud would rest, they still keep on going, because God says no detours, no distractions, no pauses, no red lights, no stop signs. Just keep on going. So that's why the Torah says, no. There are times when people have to stop and pause in a journey, because when the Jews were in the desert, the 40 years was not just a punishment for them, which we'll learn about later, because they cried when they heard the report of the spies and they were told they will never see the land. But this was a preparation for a goal The goal was to be able to enter the land and conquer the land, not just conquer it militarily, but conquer it spiritually. They needed to be prepared. They couldn't just be traveling all the time. They had to stop, they had to integrate and internalize the spiritual energy at each one of these junctures. So true, the idea of journeying should have been ingrained in them, and that was correct. But sometimes you have to stop in order to travel further. In the laws of Shabbos, we know we're not allowed to carry in Shabbos, and the laws are that if you stop to rest, then that's considered a stop. If you stop just to organize your what you're carrying, that's not considered a stop. It's as if you're continuing to journey. Here also, their stops were part of the journey, as Rashi himself will say in the next verse. However, the Rebbe told us that we are living, unrelated to this verse, but we are living in times where we have been told, without any question, that we are in the last legs of our journey towards the future redemption. And there cannot be any more stops. We had enough stops for thousands of years, enough detours, enough trials, enough persecutions, enough backsliding, enough confusion and chaos. Now is the time, uninterrupted. We have to, at least in our own minds, and we pray that God will not create any obstacles for us, and we just go straight, marching straight towards the redemption. Just want to conclude, today was the yahrzeit of one of the great Hasidic masters, Rabbi Melech of Lizensk, who was a colleague of the Alter Rebbe, the first Chabad Rebbe, and a story that involves both of them was once the Alter Rebbe was in the home of an opponent of the Hasidic movement, and he showed him where he kept Rabbi Melech's work called Noam Elimelech. That's his classic work, that he kept it underneath the benches on the floor in a very disrespectful place. And he said to the Alter Rebbe, "Do you know this man?" "Yes." "So what do you think about him?" He said, "If you would put him there, he wouldn't say anything. He is so humble." And when he heard that, he took the book out of its disrespectful place, gave it a kiss, and brought it back to a more dignified place in his bookcase. So, as we say in the yahrzeit of a great person, Zechusa Yogan Aleinu, may his merit protect us, and may we emulate his holy ways of humility, and may he intercede in our behalf with God to bring an end to Golus, to exile. One of his favorite themes in his works is the greatness of a tzaddik. And though today not too many of us can say that they are at that level, but in the days of Mashiach we will all be on the level of tzaddikim, and we will all be able to meet the standards that have been set for us by this great tzaddik, Rebbe Melech of Lizensk. Have a good night and a good Shabbos and a very good week.